Good morning, everybody. I'm Leek Davis. I'm the director of the Research Center for Scottish Studies, and very, very happy to have you here. There is apparently another event that many people who are interested in the talk are going to that event. So I am recording the event itself, and I will turn it off before questions. So just so that you feel comfortable, you're not being recorded with the questions that you might have for Marjory Harper afterwards. But the lecture itself will be recorded as we have Marjory's permission for that. So Dr. Marjory Harper, a professor of history at the University of Aberdeen, and also visiting professor at the Center for History, University of the Highlands and Islands. And her research focuses on British, particularly Scottish, emigration since around 1800, from 1800. Two of her monographs have won international prizes, and she's published around 100 articles and book chapters, which is pretty astonishing in our field. Her monograph, Testimonies of Transition, an Oral History of 20th Century Scottish Emigration, was published in 2018, and a revised version was published as an audiobook in 2020. So a really interesting way of engaging with the oral histories that way. She is currently completing a book on emigration from the Northern Isles, and she's speaking to us today about Show This Letter to as many of our friends as possible. Scottish emigrants' correspondence in the 19th and 20th centuries. Marjory Harper.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your invitation. And again, thanks everybody for turning up. I'm delighted to be here. And the sort of trigger was a set of correspondence that Leith was telling me about a while ago. Maybe say a little bit more about that once this is over. But what I'd like to do, first of all, is to introduce you to Annie McRitchie. Annie emigrated from the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides to Detroit in 1952. And she spent the rest of her life there until she passed away last year in her 90s. But she maintained strong links with her homeland, partly by visiting, but largely through an extraordinarily regular correspondence. And I'll let Annie explain in her own words from an interview I did with her in 2009.
That was my favourite hobby, waiting for the week to come when I worked. I used to go to that front door to see if he was at the end of the street. Couldn't wait for him. My mother wrote, my sisters, and all my friends and relatives. And the last number of years I started saving letters because they did not find the train anymore. So I have boxes of letters, and I love to read. I love to go through them once in a while.
There's another issue there that we could look at, and that is the way that Annie has retained her Hebridean accent, despite a half a century in Detroit. Another talk for another day, maybe. Well, such faithfulness in writing is in itself remarkable, but even more remarkable is that for decades, the collection of correspondence remained intact. Annie kept every letter that her parents had written to her, and when she went back to Lewis to clear her late parents' house, she found that they'd kept all the letters that she'd written to them. Now, sadly, it seems that the family archive has been lost or destroyed following Annie's death. And that's deprived us of the rare treasure of an epistolary dialogue, because most letter collections are one directional. It's rare to get a complete collection two ways. But her story, I think, also flags up the overarching takeaway of today's event, which is the value of writing and retaining letters, which is, of course, a dying art in our digital age of instantaneous soundbite and often very superficial communication. Now, for Annie, the objective of letter writing was to convey and receive family news. And that was indeed the objective of many emigrant letters. And the quote that I've used as a peg on which to hang this talk is one example of that. Shortly after John Mackey emigrated from Aberdeenshire to the Clare Valley in South Australia in 1852, he instructed his brother and that's the Clare Valley in the background, in the picture there. He said, "You will show this letter to as many of our friends as possible." Imperative, you will. I often think of you all. Perhaps the best way would be to send it to the Aberdeen Journal, as all our friends on the Dee, the Don, the Spey and the Devon, the whole county, will then have an opportunity of seeing that I am living and liking the Antipodes well. So in other words, Mackie's strategy was to disseminate his news through the medium of the local newspaper. And a century later, when Annie McRitchie was growing up in the village of Coll, near Stornoway, she learnt about the US not from the press, but from a more direct source, which was the letters sent back by people who'd emigrated earlier and sent back to their families. And what she heard had a direct effect on her desire to emigrate. So we'll listen to Annie once again.
Childhood, we were about one of the youngest families in the village. Most of the families around me were older, and they had people who emigrated in the 20s and before then, and early 30s. And the way of life in the country then, you just, when you were 3 years old, you would go off to your neighbour's house and walk in any time. You didn't knock the door, I practically lived in the neighbours' houses. And most of them had family in the US, and I used to hear them talk about the family, and I was just interested in what was going on over in the US, because it's another part of the world, and then I used to see packages coming from there with things that I had never seen before, and things that I coveted.
So it wasn't just letters, it was what came in the packages. Actually, my mother used to say that about when her relatives had gone to Hamilton in Ontario and they sent back clothes, and it was different from the clothes they got in Scotland. What I'd like to do for the rest of the time is to think about the significance of emigrant correspondence by looking through the lens of some of the recurring themes that emerge from a selection of letters. And it's complex because there are multiple layers of meaning and intentionality. Letters can have both practical and psychological objectives. They can be aspirational. They can be disingenuous, as the writers kind of self-invent the narrative of their own lives as they choose what they disclose or what they hide or what they airbrush. So we have to read both with the grain and against the grain in order to understand even partially the different dimensions. So I'm going to use examples for most of the talk, but before I get onto the examples, I just want to set a kind of theoretical framework, some general observations about letters as a source. And then the themes, I hope, will illustrate some of the general points. Until the invention of the telephone, letters were almost the only way of maintaining a relationship or transacting business across countries and continents. Okay, there were telegrams, but you didn't use a telegram except in extremis. Sometimes correspondence was just a conduit for the straightforward transfer of information about experiences and lifestyles. Sometimes it was a mechanism for issuing instructions or warnings or recommendations. And in some cases, encouragement might go further if the letter enclosed a remittance or a prepaid ticket to help your correspondent go and join you. So that meant family reunions could be implemented. In private correspondence, often contained a cumulative weight of encouragement. If the letters went on over a period of time. Initially, you would get the reassuring presence of an advice of a contact who was already settled overseas, and that might lead on to practical assistance in arranging the relocation of family members, either by sending money or by fixing up a farm or a job in advance, offering a welcoming hand on arrival. Then sometimes, penultimate bullet point there were formal letters of introduction that emigrants carried with them to secure jobs or places to stay. And one example, and that's why I put the famous photograph on the bottom, is of Donald Smith. It's a name that might be familiar to you as a fur trader, a politician, and a financier, and one of the financial masterminds behind the construction of the CPR. Donald Smith, who became Lord Strathcona, went out in 1838 from Forres in Scotland as an apprentice clerk with the Hudson's Bay Company, and he carried with him a letter of introduction from an uncle who was a chief factor with the Bay, and that sort of carrying of letters of introduction was very common. Now, whether or not there was an anticipation of chain migration on the part of letter writers, it was normally expected that they would write home, emigrants would write home. And if letters failed to appear, there would be disappointment, there'd be consternation and alarm. And nowhere is the anguish of unanswered letters more evident than in the petitions that were submitted to Scottish courts under the so-called Presumption of Life Limitation Act Scotland, very sort of pompous title for something that's actually really quite an intriguing source. That legislation was passed in 1881 and 1891. And what it involved was petitioners seeking to discover the fate of long lost relatives, often overseas. And it was usually so they could settle inheritance. It's, you know, the people who disappeared after 7 years, they would be presumed dead. Okay, what does an in-depth analysis of letters tell us? By scrutinizing the economic motives and the social psychologies of individuals, we can understand on a broader tapestry why emigration waxed and waned, why it dripped unobtrusively or hemorrhaged dramatically. We can glimpse contemporary perceptions and prejudices about different destinations, and we can learn about different mechanisms of relocation. You know, for instance, was it preferable to be independent, totally independent, or to accept sponsorship and subsidy? Were sponsored migrants like the £10, so-called £10 POMs who went out to Australia and New Zealand less likely than self-funding Canadian or American migrants to plan their move meticulously because they weren't making such a personal financial investment in it. There was certainly a lot of grumbling in Australia about the Brits who wanted to go out on a 2-year holiday paid for by Australia, but that's another story. And then again, what do letters tell us about the issues that determined whether the decision to uproot was impulsive or the product of careful planning? And then the penultimate point there, we can trace trajectories of attitudes. When we have a sequence of letters, we can sometimes use them to track a trajectory of attitudes among the letter writers. And we'll see that a little bit later on with some of the examples. And the final point there is about the need for discernment. As with all sources, we have to be discerning when analysing letters. And there are a number of biases to look out for. And the most obvious of those biases is that not all immigrants wrote, because not all could write. The illiterate were disenfranchised from corresponding. Other ways of disenfranchisement might involve cost. It was expensive to send letters. There's probably also a slant towards recording success, because failed migrants were likely either to remain silent or, if they could afford it, to go home. Others, like John Mackey in Australia, who we met a few minutes ago, wrote self-consciously for a wider readership, whether it was the local community around which their letter might be circulated, or, as with Mackey, the local newspaper, or the journal or pamphlet editor who might have commissioned the letter. It's another type of letter. And we have to be aware that the letters that were shaped with the recipient or recipients in mind. So the same letter writer might tell a very different story depending on the person to whom he or she was writing. And except in very rare cases, there was, as I've already said, a kind of one-sided asymmetry. And indeed, it's quite uncommon for even a full set of one-directional correspondence to survive. A lot of the letters we have are sort of single little snippets. And while private letters were biased towards recording what the writer thought the recipient would want to know or needed to know, those published in newspapers, periodicals, recruitment pamphlets, and guidebooks were likely to reflect the outlook of the host publication. And in some cases, they were actually commissioned directly, or if they weren't commissioned directly, they might be subjected to editorial intrusion and selection. Letters that were written to order, as you might say, and published in the fundraising publications of, for example, women's emigration societies or child migration societies, were particularly formulaic. They usually consisted of a paean of praise to the sponsor or the sponsoring organization or the host family. And of course, those bodies and those individuals were very often standing over the shoulder of the letter writer, particularly the child letter writers, and censoring or editing the contents. If you, if you had a horrible placement as a child somewhere in the middle of rural Ontario, you weren't going to write back to Quarriers Homes and say, this is absolutely dreadful and I'm being beaten up every day, because who was looking at what you were writing? The host. Again, another story. Although they clearly can't be taken at face value, these commissioned letters, it is possible, I think, to read between the lines, and in some cases to detect problems of loneliness, hardship, or even abuse. And some contemporaries were actually aware of that kind of misleading gloss. And particularly newspaper editors, particularly of publications that were hostile to emigration, warned readers not to be taken in by everything they read, because it was selective. And the final point is, and I don't think you can really see this, but I think I've got a bigger image of it coming up later, is the very practical issue of legibility. Some letters are almost impossible to read, and because they deteriorate over time, ravages of vermin, damp, whatever it might be. Okay, that was a long introduction, but I want to shift the focus now by zooming in on examples that I hope will illustrate some of the general points that I've just been making. And since I'm in Canada, most of my examples will come from Canada, albeit most of them from further east. But the Scot was a global emigrant, as you know, and I will draw briefly on letters from other parts of the world. So if we move on to think, first of all, about imparting information. And I've got two Alexanders here as my examples, Muir and Robertson. Alexander Muir was not an emigrant to Canada, but a visitor, a temporary visitor. He was a relatively wealthy Aberdeen lawyer who'd also bought a country estate just outside the city. And in 1845, he took a sailing ship from the port of Aberdeen across the Atlantic so that he could visit his brother and sister who had emigrated to Upper Canada. And before he left home, he promised his 9-year-old son, George, that he would write to him regularly, describing his experiences. And the result is that we have a letter diary covering almost 3 months of his travels and giving George regular lessons in Canadian geography and history. So that was the kind of instructive imparting of information that Alexander Muir went in for. His letter diary ultimately ended up in the archives of Ontario. Now, Muir was one of only two cabin passengers on the timber ship, the Lord Seaton, which left the port of Aberdeen, which you see on the left there. And there were 71 passengers on that ship, including 31 children, and 71 included the crew. Muir's letters, like many others written on board ship, tell us about the transatlantic voyage, tell us a lot about it. Because writing letters or a diary on board ship was one way of relieving boredom during a passage that could last for many, many weeks. And until the mid-19th century, it was very common for sailing ships, to leave from ports right around the British Isles. This was because of the timber trade with North America, because they were going out on timber ships that had brought in lumber from the St. Lawrence and the maritime provinces. And the agents and the owners of these ships were looking for a paying cargo on the outward voyage, because timber was bulky but low in value in proportion to the space it occupied. So emigrants were they found to be an ideal cargo. If you were going as a steerage passenger, you paid about £4. If you were going as a cabin passenger, you paid £10. And as I say, lots of ports participated. I mean, those of you who've been to Aberdeen wouldn't think of it as an emigrant port, but in the 19th century, around 15,500 people emigrated directly from the port of Aberdeen, mainly to Canada, some to States, to New York. That's between about 1830 and 1860, and the timber trade then faded because of the coming of steamships. On to the second Alexander. Sometimes shipboard letters conveyed tragic news, because a year after Alexander Muir embarked at Aberdeen, another Alexander Robertson from the village of Money Musk, which is about 25 miles inland from Aberdeen, embarked at the same port with his wife, pregnant wife, and 7 children. And during the voyage, his wife gave birth to a premature baby, and both the wife and the baby died very soon after the birth. And as was the custom, they were buried at sea. So a tragedy, and a tragedy that Alexander articulated, because as the ship neared the end of its voyage up the St. Lawrence to dock in Montreal, he wrote back to his parents-in-law, quote, "I take up my pen to acquaint you with the dreadful affliction that has befallen me in the death of my wife. I often wish that we would be driven against some rock, that we might all have the same grave," unquote. And I can tell you a little bit more about that later if you're interested. Okay, so the imparting of information was one function of the emigrant letter. What about instructions, encouragement, advice, and warnings? This is the core of the presentation. I'm going to spend most time on this. First of all, an example from Australia, which that's the picture that you saw in a smaller thumbnail a little bit earlier. This demonstrates both the frustrations and the rewards of using correspondence, because this first letter, from which I'm going to quote, was extremely difficult to read. You can probably see that little white bit in the middle is where there's a bit missing. It's crossed. You know, you write that way, and then you write that way, and it was written on both sides of the paper, and it was like tissue paper, so it's very difficult to winkle out what's being said. It took me 5 days to read that letter, but it was worth it in the end. Okay, I'll tell you about what was in it. William, Patrick, George, and Walter Leslie were the 4 sons of William Leslie, who was the Laird of Wart Hill, on the left there, Wart Hill Castle in Aberdeen, the Wart Hill Estate in Aberdeenshire. The oldest son, William, went to Sri Lanka, or as it was then, Ceylon, and the others in various stages to Eastern Australia, where they became pioneers of commercial sheep farming in northern New South Wales, now southern Queensland. And that picture on the right is Canning Downs, where they ended up with a big sheep farm. And the family's letters demonstrate the significance of personal and community chains, networks. In particular, the way in which they used their father to recruit employees for their Australian estates from the estate back home in Scotland. They did not trust convicts, and they did not want to choose workers indiscriminately from the hordes of unknown emigrants who were coming out under assistance passages, the so-called bounty scheme. And again, I can explain that if you're interested. No, what they wanted was reliable, hand-picked workers from workers who would be suited to their particular needs, their precise needs, and they sent home very precise instructions in the letters to their father, telling him to recruit specific individuals from the Wart Hill estate. And this example comes from that highly illegible letter, and it's written by Patrick in 1839. And he said, "There are emigration agents in all parts of the country where intending emigrants can apply for passage and every other information they want. However, I want 6 men of the description I will state directly, and I do not want to pay their passage out and to have them indented for 7 years to me. But if 6 men such as I will describe will come out here in any vessel and give me notice before they come of their intentions, I will hire them at the current rate of wages in the colony, but of course I will pay no part of their expenses out. I will just hire them from the ship, as if I had never heard of them before." So a little bit disingenuous. He's trying to kind of circumvent the rules and regulations of the bounty emigration scheme. So using his father. And Father William did accede to this request. He sent out the workers. He also acceded to the request to send out a bull. So the bull, unfortunately, died of seasickness in the Bay of Biscay. It didn't get very far. So they ate it. And perhaps that's why they were commercial sheep farmers rather than cattle farmers. The bull never made it to its destination. And it wasn't just the William Leslie Sr., it wasn't just the father who got involved, so did the mother, Jane Leslie. Also in 1839, a ploughman from the Wart Hill estate, a man called Sandy Wright, was sent out to be an overseer on the sheep farm. And he carried with him a letter written by Mrs. Leslie to her sons, asking them to look after Sandy. And she wrote, Sandy may not be full of good manners, but having good upright intentions will improve after he has seen a little and how others do. For as yet, he's never been out of his father's house and is what may be termed rather a greenhorn, and I wish he was safe and sound in New South Wales. I have heard a love match made him determine on this step, as his parents were against the marriage and would not give him any part or portion of the farm. So some say the match is given up. Others say they will meet in Aberdeen and be married and go together. We don't know. That we never found out what happened. And finally, with the Leslies, the other significant feature of the Leslies' letters is that they drew out to the same part of Eastern Australia the sons of other landed families in the same district of Aberdeenshire who were similarly inspired to try their luck at sheep farming because of the Leslies' example. The Gordons of Manar, which is the house on the top right there, the Elphinstone Dalrymples of Logie, top left, and the Leith Hayes of Leith Hall. So all pretty well-heeled families, as you can see from their dwelling houses. Okay, I said I was going to concentrate mainly on Canada, so I'll switch the focus back to Canada now. I'm going to give 6 illustrations under this heading, some of them very brief, others slightly longer. First of all, a brief Hebridean perspective. John Bowie was an Edinburgh lawyer who was one of the witnesses to a parliamentary inquiry into emigration in 1841. And in giving his evidence, he noted that many Highland emigrants sent home letters, quote, strongly recommending their friends to follow them, unquote. And that pattern that John Bowie identified continued later into the century. Another government commission in the 1880s, for those of you who know a bit about Scottish history, it's the Napier Commission to which I'm referring. This government commission referred back to a letter written by an emigrant from Lewis in 1851, a man called Malcolm MacLeod, and he was writing to his brother from the eastern townships of Quebec. And he wrote, as you see there, my dear brother, I hope before you are done reading this letter, your mind will be made up and that you will not hesitate for a moment to say that you're going to come, and we shall help you. So there's the incentive. We shall help you. Linger no longer on the barren soil of the poor decaying Lewes. So Hebridean example. Back to Aberdeenshire for the next example, and William Scott. William Scott was a man who was obsessed with money. His persistent quest to protect and improve his financial status was the dominant thread of almost all the 45 letters that he wrote, mainly from Upper Canada, to his mother and siblings in Aberdeenshire during 32 years from 1831 through to 1863. And most of those letters were either plaintive or belligerent in their presumption that the family in Aberdeenshire should finance his Canadian enterprises. He was also selective in the information that he disclosed or withheld. So back to that theoretical point about, what did emigrant letters say and what did they hide? In August 1834, he wrote to his brother from Liverpool, from where he was about to embark for New York. But the information about Liverpool was contained in a postscript on a separate page, because he wanted to withhold from his mother the main reason why he was in Liverpool. He wrote to his brother in on that page, if my mother wants to see my letter, you can tear this page off and show the other to her, unquote. And he only told mother that he'd emigrated when he was 4,000 miles away in Upper Canada. And he wrote then, you will perhaps think that I was very foolish in coming to this country, but when I considered the great risk of embarking my capital in farming in the old country, I made up my mind to visit America. And as yet, I have seen no reason to repent the step I have taken, unquote. Kind of yaboo, so mother might have tried to stop him. William also commented on the places he passed through on his journey to Woolwich Township, where he bought a property. And his travels included the de rigueur visit to Niagara Falls. I spent 2 days in doing nothing but looking at them, and would willingly have spent a month if I could have afforded time. I think myself repaid for crossing the Atlantic by having seen them, unquote. So he had some kind of appreciation of landscape. But as I've already said, his obsession was money. He assured his brother, perhaps a little too fulsomely and too repetitively, that his business acumen was much admired in the area where he'd settled, not least by his fellow Scots. So he was in an area where there were many other Scots. And he upbraided both his brother and his sister for failing to send him money to implement, or to lend him money to implement his business plans. And even when writing about his impending marriage to a woman whose family had also emigrated from Scotland, money dominated the theme. They are a most respectable family and are well off, he assured his mother. And even the Canadian rebellions of 1837 to 38 were viewed through the lens of their impact on his investments. So everything was suffused with this, money-making theme. William demanded, or sometimes demanded, letters by return of post. And he complained if letters from Scotland were either not forthcoming at all or were too short. Chided his brother in 1837 in these words: "You have been little from home and are not aware of the pleasure one has of getting a letter, or you would write a little oftener." Well, the reminder apparently failed, because he repeated his plea in sharper tones 7 months later, when he wrote, "In your last letter to me, you mentioned that you was to write me again very soon. I have been long expecting your promised letter, but as I have never received it, I conclude you've either forgot your promise, or perhaps you have been troubled with a fit of laziness." So, pretty snippy. William's letters are peppered with contradictions. On the one hand, he repeatedly declared his confidence in Canada as a place to invest, usually when he was trying to persuade his brother to invest money there, to remit money. But in almost the same breath, at the same time, he wrote to his brother that he would leave Canada tomorrow if he could sell out and go to the USA. So there's a contradiction. But then in another letter, he decried the US and said he was pleased that he hadn't settled in a country where, to quote him, "the inhabitants have such deep-rooted prejudices against everything British, and where the government is unable to protect their own subjects against popular violence," unquote. Well, unlike many of his countrymen, and perhaps not surprisingly, Scott's letters contained no remittances. He was keeping all his money to himself, contained no remittances and no encouragement to family members to join him, other than two very indirect comments. One was to his mother, where he said, "I don't despair of seeing you here yet," and another to his brother, where he said, "Crossing the Atlantic will now be no more thought of than going from Aberdeen to London." That was in 1838. But he did frequently refer to acquaintances who had either emigrated to the area or were contemplating doing so. And he was not always complimentary about them. One Mr. Brown, don't know who Mr. Brown was, but Mr. Brown and some others, all from Aberdeen, had gone out and purchased land near Woolwich. And William wrote to his brother in 1836, "I think it is a very bad plan for a person that is not accustomed to work hard, or indeed any person from the old country, to purchase wild land, as the natives are accustomed to the axe from their infancy, and on that account are able to clear land at much expense than people from the old country." So it's this idea of, needing to clear the land, but they don't know how to do it. William also warned his brother against believing too readily the assertions of emigrants who'd returned to Scotland. Of one, he said, "He is a notorious liar. Of course he will run down this country because he was not likely to succeed in it himself." And then of another, at the other end of the spectrum, he wrote of a returner who'd allegedly gone back with £30,000, which was a hefty sum of money. "I am not inclined to believe he's made as much as he stated." So he's very cynical. Like many emigrants, William also used his letters to arrange for packages and money to be brought out in the safekeeping of visitors and emigrants from home. Sometimes he sent items back to his family by similar means. And that leads me on to the next, much more brief illustration. Elizabeth Connon, she's not mentioned in the slide there, but Elizabeth Connon was an Aberdeen shopkeeper who wrote frequently to her nephew in Upper Canada, the Elora area, after he'd emigrated in 1852. And Elizabeth's shop in King Street, Aberdeen, was a stopping place for departing emigrants, whom she often entrusted with letters or parcels for nephew Thomas, and also for other people whom she knew in Bonaccord Township. And Bonaccord Township was named because there were so many settlers from Aberdeen there. Bonaccord is the motto of the city of Aberdeen. I couldn't find anywhere that had the motto. That's actually taken on a photograph taken on a litter bin in Aberdeen city centre. Anyway, there was this big concentration of settlers from Aberdeen and its hinterland. And Elizabeth's interactions with people on both sides of the Atlantic reflect the strong networks that were forged and maintained through regular letters. And now, among the pioneers of that township were a married couple, Alexander Watt and his wife, Barbara Argo, along with Barbara's two brothers who emigrated with them. Now, Barbara's sister, Margaret Argo, stayed in Scotland, and she wrote regularly to her sister out in Canada, giving family and community gossip, not least about those who were leaving for Canada. And Margaret craved letters in return, as you'll see from this example, because this was shortly after Barbara and Alexander had emigrated in 1836. Margaret wrote, "Begin a letter to me as soon as you get this, and write something in it every day when you have time, and write it very close so that I may have something in the form of a definite correspondence with you. Write anything, write everything, and I will do the same. I will expect a letter from you every 6 months, and oftener if anything particular happens." Well, she wasn't really asking all that much. She only wanted a letter every 6 months. It wasn't too arduous. Another Argo brother, David, was keen to join his siblings in Canada, but he stayed on working the family farm in Aberdeenshire out of loyalty to their father, and even after the lease was lost. And that leads on actually to the third of my illustrations. And it's one of my favorites because of the richness of the correspondence and the extraordinary number of people who emigrated in one batch from a fairly small, very small rural parish, fairly close to the royal estate at Balmoral, the parish of Logie Coldstone on Upper Deeside. So the story here is of two related families, the Farquharsons and the Fletchers. So John Fletcher and Charles Farquharson were brothers-in-law. Their letters demonstrate very clearly the role of precedent and chain migration, dating back to the original movement, the original settlement of another Fletcher, a man called James Fletcher, near Chatham in the 1830s, and eventually leading to the emigration of 26 people in one go in 1866, including Charles and his wife. And the key trigger in terms of encouragement, in terms of what drew them to Canada, was the constant stream of letters coming from Canada, encouraging relatives and friends to try their fortune across the Atlantic, with the promise from John Fletcher of help to Charles in acquiring a farm and helping him settle in. He wrote in one letter, I can get you this land and I'll plant potatoes to clear the ground for you before you come. Now, that was the incentive. The expulsive trigger from home, the home end, was the lack of opportunity and prospects, particularly when the lease terminated. So a little bit like David Argo staying on, even though the lease had terminated on his father's farm. Although in the Farquharson case, they didn't actually lose the lease. They didn't lose the farm. It was just that the rent was bumped up enormously when the lease was renewed. Just a word or two about the context for this. The context for this and for much emigration from lowland rural Scotland in the 19th century was that commercialization of farming was undermining the well-being of tenant farmers. So there was very little owner occupation, almost none. And the tenant farmers found that when their leases expired, they often couldn't be renewed. Sometimes it was because the rent had been bumped up so much they couldn't afford it, but more challengingly and more commonly possibly, the farm itself would simply disappear as small farms were consolidated into bigger and bigger units in the interests of the capitalist landowners to maximize production. And that was a recurring theme in an awful lot of emigrant correspondence. So you get that kind of push, but at the same time, you get the pull of a lot of publicity about Upper Canada in particular being the poor man's country. That was a phrase that was commonly used. A land of owner occupation, where a farm could be passed on to succeeding generations in perpetuity with no interfering landlord. And that was a big, it's a mirror image of what's happening in Scotland and a big pull. And that's a big issue with the Farquharsons and the Fletchers. Charles Farquharson took a long time to make up his mind to go to Upper Canada, mainly because his wife was reluctant to leave her homeland, her parents, and her sister. And in fact, both sets of parents didn't want them to go. But in 1866, along with 24 of their neighbours, bear in mind how small the parish was, they took the plunge, aided by another Fletcher brother, William, who'd settled in Chatham in 1842. but he returned home to keep a promise that he'd made in a letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law back in 1860, in which he said, "I have always liked Canada and have never wished to be back in Scotland to live. But if you resolve to come, send me word and I will go home to help you pack your baggage, tell you what to bring, and accompany you across the ocean." So the ground had been prepared for that community emigration by the regularity of the correspondence, the promises that were made in the correspondence, but also, and very significantly, by the fact that the contents of the correspondence was circulated within the parish around friends and neighbours. So it was well known how the Farquharsons and Fletchers would, or the Fletchers rather, were doing out in Upper Canada, just like Annie McRitchie had found when she was growing up in Lewis in the 1920s and 30s. And that practice was common and it was persistent. We're getting through our examples, just a couple more. In the same general area of Aberdeenshire, James Thompson, a baker, left the village of Aboyne in 1844. And he went first to Montreal, where he had a letter, well, not a letter, he had letters of introduction to Henry Esson, who was the Scottish minister of St. Gabriel Street Presbyterian Church in Montreal. And Esson himself was a native of D-side of the Aboyne area. And using these letters of introduction, James was able to use Esson to secure lodgings and a job, also with emigrants from Aberdeenshire, fellow Scots anyway. And then James Thompson's own letters back home to his father and sister often mentioned the practical assistance that he had received from fellow countrymen as he worked his way across Canada and the States and worked his way towards his ultimate ambition of achieving his own farm, acquiring his own farm. He did that by working for wages as a baker, a storeman, a clerk, and a logger, all the way from Montreal across Upper Canada to California, where he participated in the gold rush, not as a gold miner, but as a baker. He was quite prescient there. Gold mining was a fool's game mostly, but the miners needed to eat. So it was better to be a baker, and he wrote home about that. As well as saving money for the farm that he wanted to acquire, and which he got at Edwardsburg, Ontario eventually, he regularly remitted money to his family. And in 1856, he brought over his father, his sister, and 2 children of a deceased sister to join him on that farm. Now, my final example of a farming emigrant's letters that demonstrate both encouragement and warning come from much later, the first years of the 20th century. The picture in the middle there is the farm, Keppenach farm, from which this man that I'm going to talk about came. And I'm just going to see if this works. Yes, this is a video I took 2 weeks ago when I went to look at the location. I don't like talking about places that I've not visited. So this is, I'll talk over the video, you can have a look at it. It's in the upper reaches of the River Findhorn. And it's to do with a man called John McBain, who left this area in 1902 to seek betterment in Manitoba. Now, over the next 3 years, just over 3 years, he had a peripatetic existence. There's the farm coming up now. He worked intermittently as a farm labourer and a journalist, but he was plagued by ill health and he died early in 1906. But by the time he died, he'd written home 74 letters to his brother and sister. Back in Scotland. And many of them referred to his encounters with fellow Scots, who he felt, come back to that one, who he felt played a disproportionate role in prairie life. But what I find particularly interesting about John McBain is the equivocation he showed when writing about prospects for immigrants, particularly his brother. He wrote in March 1903, writing to their sister, "I would never think of advising Andy to sell out and come here, for I know he would hate the country and the people he would never get along with. He would die of homesickness." John McBain clearly feared that he would be held accountable if his brother came out and was disappointed. But within a year, the tone of his letters had changed completely, and he was fulsome in his encouragement of Andrew to emigrate, writing, "Do you think Andy will come to Canada? I hope he will." And there was an exclamation mark in the original letter. So what had changed? Well, self-interest brought about the change. It was because an opportunity had arisen for John McBain to acquire a farm for $10,000, a sum which he was incapable of raising without his brother's co-investment. So that was the reason for the change of tone. He just needed his brother's money. And perhaps the contradictions that pervade all his letters as a whole are a reflection of his frustration at never really achieving the freedom that he craved. Okay, rushing on, getting towards the end, don't worry. Next, move on. I said that was the core of the paper, and that's the section on which I was going to spend most time. We'll deal much more briefly with the rest. There was a long discussion of farming emigrants, but I want to talk a little bit about nostalgia and homesickness in correspondence. And I'll switch continents briefly for a couple of examples. Robert Miller emigrated from Orkney to Australia in the 1880s before becoming a founder member of a communist colony in Paraguay, in the heart of Paraguay. Quite sort of extraordinary. He wrote regularly to his aunt and uncle back in Orkney. And what is striking about his letters is that he expended much more ink on questions and comments about people and life back in Orkney than he did about telling them about his own experiences. He wrote in one letter, "I've got no news worth telling you, and there is no use of me filling up a letter of rubbish," unquote. That's what he wrote from Western Australia in 1891 before he went to Paraguay. And he also deflected attention from himself. Shortly after arriving in Paraguay, he wrote, "I might have told you many things before, but I never care much for relating my own experience. It seems to me to look sort of self-egotistical." So a kind of different approach. He frequently asked after his two young cousins, hoping that they would write to tell him how they were getting on at school, and he hung a framed picture of them in his lodgings. And he wrote in another letter, "Although we are far separate in body, yet for my part we are not so far distant in mind, for there is never a day that I am not thinking about you." And he clearly missed Orkney. He always referred to Orkney as home, even though he was a long time away from Orkney. And he often asked for news of people and places. He sometimes hinted at homesickness, but any such hints were always harnessed to a determination to banish that sort of thought. And he was determined from the start to maintain a monthly communication, enclosing a remittance really as often as he could. And almost every letter he wrote was accompanied by an exhortation to his relatives to do the same, write back. And occasionally he chided them gently, much more gently than William Scott did, for the infrequency of their letters. This is also a persistent theme about nostalgia. Letter writing was an emotional lifeline for successive generations of emigrants. And this lady is another of my interviewees, Sheena McBain or Sheena Coyne from Inverness, who told me that she felt really alone when she received no Christmas post in Western Australia. This was in 1970. She said, until the problem was traced to a rogue postman who had been throwing mail over the hedge instead of delivering it. So the people were writing letters, but she wasn't receiving them. Just galloping ahead, sponsored emigration and formulaic letters. I mentioned at the beginning, when we were doing the kind of theoretical introduction, the letters that were written to order. So just a brief word about this. We have to treat their, as I said, their glowing contents with a big grain of salt. We have to read between the lines. And organizations that sponsored young women and disadvantaged children give us the most obvious examples of this. And of course, child migration has become particularly notorious in recent years. Some letters, let's just say a little bit about the women to start with. Some letters were commissioned and selected by recruitment agents to promote their cause. Just one example. Isabella Stewart was an agent, a recruitment agent, who recruited domestic servants for Canada from Northeast Scotland in the early 20th century. And she sent to the Aberdeen Journal, that newspaper we've already mentioned, for publication, a letter that she'd received from somebody called Maggie Masson, who'd emigrated in 1913 under Mrs. Stewart's auspices. And I think we can detect Mrs. Stewart's editorial pen in what Maggie allegedly wrote, not least in the phrasing, because the phrasing doesn't really sound like a domestic servant who'd left school probably at 13. Everything is so much easier than in the homeland. We have a lovely electric washing machine, so we can sit and eat breakfast and have the washing going on at the same time. We dine at the same table as the master and mistress and travel first class with them. I cannot thank you enough for recommending me to a good family. And it's the last part, this sentence that I think doesn't sound like she wrote it. I shall never rue leaving dear old Scotland. I can't see a domestic servant writing that. I think sure Mrs. Stewart's editorial pen came in there. I shall never rue leaving dear old Scotland, and I should certainly advise anyone I know in service to come out here. So that I'm pretty sure that was edited. But unhappiness and mistreatment do emerge from some of the women's letters, but they're even more, those traits are even more evident in the children's correspondence. As you probably know, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw numerous philanthropic schemes to rescue and rehabilitate destitute children. And a major part of the policy was to send them overseas, around 100,000 in all from Britain between 1870 and 1930. In Scotland, the main organisation was Corrier's Orphan Homes, just to the southwest of Glasgow, seen on the left there. I don't know why I'm looking around because I can see it there. And then they were sent from the 1880s to a receiving home at Brockville in Ontario, which is the picture on the right. And they sent around 5,000 of the 20,000 children whom they took in out to Ontario. And from that home at Brockville, they would be distributed to farms and households across the whole province. And an integral part of the fundraising policy of Corrier's, and indeed other homes, was to publish in their annual reports glowing letters of praise and gratitude, ostensibly written by the children. The problem, of course, as we've indicated, were that they were often written to order, vetted or edited by the employer or the home's management, and only the most positive was selected for publication. But even then, even within those caveats, we see examples. We can read between the lines and see glimpses of homesickness and loneliness. I'll use another organisation now to demonstrate this, because another institution that emigrated children, albeit in much smaller numbers, was the Aberlour Orphanage on Speyside. And several of its recruits, and only 56 went, but they were their letters are much more explicit, if you like. They often admitted that they cried for home. And this is what one boy wrote wistfully in 1888. America is rightly called the New World. Everything is new here, and one seems to be in another planet altogether. But it is not all sunshine out here. The cold in winter is terrible, and the heat in summer overpowering. And it is not all who get on well here, any more than in the old country. There are many failures. Only none starve here. Food is plentiful. The mind somehow will cross the Atlantic and wander among the dear old glens of home. I often seem to hear the roar of the old Spey as it dances among the stones and rocks. Tell the lads they can live if they can live at home to do so, and if not, they should come here. Let me hear all the news when you write. And that was written to the home's management. And again, it's a bit of a backstory there to do with the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, which I can tell you about later if you're interested. Others complained of onerous farm work and voiced bitter regret that they had come to Canada. And this one is the most poignant, I think. If I ever set my foot on the soil of the old country, I shall say no more Canada for me, unquote. Well, you can't be much more explicit than that, writing to the home that has sent you out in the expectation it's going to do you good. Okay, let's conclude. Kept you a long time. The so what questions. Why are letters worth keeping? Well, I hope we've seen some reasons why letters are worth keeping in the last hour. Immigrant, for all sorts of reasons. To quote David Gerber, the historian, immigrant letters are probably the largest single body of the writing of ordinary people to which historians have access, unquote. A very, very rich treasure trove. And very varied treasure trove. We can use letters to answer contextual questions about fluctuating attitudes to emigration, about experiences of adversity and adventure, about the degree of adaptation, integration, assimilation, or alienation that the emigrants experienced. We can see through the lens of perceptions of Indigenous peoples. We can look at what they felt and said about coming back to Scotland. And we can see the different perspectives of men and women and children who wrote letters, people who came from different social backgrounds, in different locations and different eras. So, multi-layered uses. But I think perhaps more important than their academic use, letters speak to the heart. They speak to the heart of the writers and recipients in particular, but they also speak to subsequent generations to whom they offer a vibrant window into the lives of their forebears. And I think that's particularly the case when it's our own families, because we have that, that connection with them. And we began with Annie McRitchie, and I'm going to end with her sister-in-law, Marilyn McRitchie, because Marilyn came in the opposite direction. It's like a mirror image of Annie. Marilyn was born in Detroit, born and brought up in Detroit, but in 1966, she emigrated to the Isle of Lewis when her husband, a minister in the Free Church of Scotland, and a native of Lewis, was called to the church in Stornoway. Again, I've got to say a lot more about Marilyn, but I interviewed them both together as well as Annie separately, and they were just lovely. They made me so welcome. And that's one of the brilliant things about doing oral history, is meeting people and interviewing them and making friends. It's just been fantastic. I've been so privileged. Anyway, that's beside the point. Marilyn echoed Annie's pleasure. Annie expressed when she'd received a letter from her family at what Marilyn still called home in the USA.
Mom wrote wonderful letters telling everything to his people. I wasn't as good a correspondent as Annie, but yeah, it was wonderful having news from home.
Did you keep the letters?
Yes, I did. Yes, and my dad had a flair for writing poetry, and all his letters were in verse. Very witty and very, very good. Yeah, so I got all those.
And we'll let Marilyn have the last word.